Good morning, honors U.S. history students. Today's topic is partially a reflection of mine and about my teaching in the way that history has been taught in the United States for quite some time, and that is the critique I have of myself is that I've tried to teach it at times through only one lens, and that being the dominant lens, and for us only to focus on, John Winthrop and later on the founding fathers, and not have any context about, well, what were other people doing? So, to begin that process of looking at U.S. history through multiple lenses, we're going to discuss today the origins of American slavery. American slavery was unique. Slavery had existed, certainly, and it had existed if you're familiar with the Bible and biblical times. But for most of history, regardless of what continent it was on, whether it was in Africa or Europe or Asia, it was mostly related to debt or a loss in war or a crime, whereas American slavery was entirely based on race. And that makes it awfully complicated. So let's talk about Jamestown, 1619. So the image that you're seeing is an image of the first African slaves arriving in the New World, and that was in 1619. These Africans were technically indentured servants. They had been kidnapped by Portuguese slave traders, and they had been brought, although most of the people on the ship died, and that wasn't uncommon. The transatlantic slave trade was brutal, and that would be true for the next 250 years. Most of the people on that ship died. The numbers vary from somewhere between, they started with 150 to upwards of 350, and only 20 would make it to the shores of Virginia. Once in Virginia, it's pretty clear that early on, a dual system emerged based on race, where there certainly were white indentured servants in early Virginia and in early colonial America, but those white indentured servants were inevitably always allowed to end their servitude, whether it be because the time that they were contracted to serve ended, or they were able to pay their way out, whatever that was. It wasn't true with African people and black people. Black people were not allowed to do so. Laws were passed very early on. Let me just read this part of the article. Here it is. The arrival at Port Comfort marked a new chapter in the history of transatlantic slave trade, which began in the early 1500s and continued into the mid-1800s. The trade uprooted roughly 12 million Africans, depositing roughly 5 million in Brazil, over 3 million in the Caribbean. Though the number of Africans brought to mainland North America was relatively small at this point, roughly 400,000, their labor and that of their descendants was crucial to the economies of the British colonies and later the United States. Two of the Africans who arrived aboard the White Lion, Antonio and Isabella, became servants of Captain William Tucker, commander of Point Comfort. Their son William is the first known African child to have been born in America, and under the law of the time, he was born a free man. In the coming decades, however, slavery became codified. Servants of African origin were oftentimes forced to continue working after the end of their contract, and in 1640 a Virginia court sentenced rebellious servant John Punch to a lifetime of slavery. With fewer white indentured servants arriving from England, a racial caste system developed, and African servants were increasingly held for life. In 1662, a Virginia court ruled that children born to enslaved mothers were the property of the mother's owner. That's the last I'll read from the article, but that's just to provide some context about the early history of African Americans and the early history of slavery. Because from the very beginning, laws were established that made it different for being black and for being white. And that would only increase dramatically in the years to follow.